My beloved child, stop scrolling for a moment. Something has been waiting to find you, not because these words are a prophecy, but because stories have a way of reaching us when our hearts are searching. Pause here and listen with your imagination open. There is a whisper in this tale, a quiet echo of hope, and before this story reaches its end, you may discover that the greatest surprises are not the ones we expect, but the ones that gently change the way we see ourselves. You have spent so much time wondering about the people who came and went from your life that you almost forgot to wonder what was happening beyond the moments you could see. Every goodbye looked final. Every silence felt permanent. Every unanswered question became another stone you carried inside your heart. Yet the story unfolding around you was never as simple as it appeared. There is someone whose footsteps once walked beside another path, convinced they had already found everything they needed. They laughed with people who applauded them, trusted voices that promised certainty, and believed they had chosen the safest direction. But even the brightest room can become empty when truth quietly slips out the back door. What no one noticed was that every smile they wore became a little harder to hold. Every celebration felt shorter. Every conversation left behind a silence that no music could drown out. They stood among crowds yet felt strangely unseen. They had everything they thought they wanted, yet something precious remained missing. You never saw those moments. You never heard the conversations that happened after everyone else had gone home. You never witnessed the long nights when questions refused to let them sleep, because some of the most important battles are fought where applause cannot reach. Perhaps you believed they had forgotten you. Perhaps you convinced yourself your chapter in their life had already closed forever. Perhaps you whispered to yourself that someone else had become more important, but stories often hide their greatest turning points beneath ordinary days. There are decisions people make that seem sudden to everyone watching. Yet those decisions have been growing quietly inside them for months. Like rain gathering behind distant clouds, the change begins long before anyone notices the storm. That is where this story truly begins. There came a moment when this special person found themselves standing in complete silence after another conversation ended. Words had been exchanged. Promises had been repeated. Familiar smiles had appeared exactly on schedule. Everything looked the same, but something inside them had changed forever. They could no longer ignore the feeling that something wasn't right, not because anyone shouted, not because there was a dramatic ending, but because truth rarely arrives with noise. Truth often arrives like dawn, slowly, quietly, almost unnoticed until suddenly the darkness is gone. The person standing before them had always seemed so important, so confident, so convincing, so certain. They admired them once, respected them, perhaps even depended on them. But admiration built upon illusion cannot survive forever. There was one sentence spoken that day. Only one. Most people would have forgotten it before dinner, yet those simple words unlocked a door that had remained closed for years. It wasn't what was said, it was what was missing. Sometimes silence tells a deeper story than speech ever could, and in that silence they realized something that shook every certainty they had ever carried. The person they trusted had been leading them toward comfort instead of truth, toward appearances instead of honesty, toward convenience instead of courage. No lightning split the sky, no dramatic music played, only the quiet realization that pretending had become too exhausting. So they walked away, not in anger, not in revenge, not to prove anything. They simply turned around and took the first honest step they had taken in a very long time. No one watching understood why. Some assumed pride, others imagined conflict, a few invented stories that never happened. People are often quick to explain decisions they never witnessed being formed, but none of them knew the real reason. And neither do you. Not yet, because the truth about who they walked away from is more surprising than anyone expected. You may think this story is about romance. It isn't only about romance. You may think it is about betrayal. It isn't only about betrayal. It is about the invisible prisons people build without realizing they are trapped inside them. Sometimes another person becomes that prison. Sometimes fear does. Sometimes the need for approval wears the face of someone we admire, and sometimes the hardest person to walk away from is the one everyone else insists you should keep following. This special person carried invisible chains for longer than anyone realized. They smiled while doubting themselves, agreed while their heart quietly disagreed, stayed where they no longer belonged because leaving felt impossible. Have you ever watched a bird hesitate at the edge of an open cage? The door is already open, freedom is already waiting, yet fear whispers that the familiar cage is safer than the unknown sky. That was their heart, until one unexpected moment changed everything. There was something they noticed. A detail so small almost everyone else overlooked it. One glance, one expression, one tiny crack in a carefully crafted image. That single moment unraveled years of illusion. They realized the person everyone admired had become someone who could only feel important if others remained uncertain about themselves. That discovery echoed through every memory. Old conversations suddenly sounded different. Old advice carried hidden meanings. Old compliments revealed quiet conditions. The pieces finally began fitting together, and once someone truly sees, they cannot return to pretending they are blind. Still, walking away is never easy. Especially when everyone believes you should stay, especially when leaving means disappointing expectations. Especially when your future suddenly becomes unwritten. They question themselves. Maybe I misunderstood. Maybe I'm overreacting. Maybe I should give it one more chance. The mind often negotiates with the very things the heart already knows must end. But deep within them was a peace unlike anything they had felt before. Not excitement, not certainty, peace, the kind that arrives when your soul recognizes the direction your fear has been trying to avoid. So they kept walking. Every step felt lighter, every breath deeper, every sunrise somehow brighter. Yet they still carried one unanswered question. If they were finally leaving behind someone so important, why did they keep thinking about you? That question followed them. Through ordinary mornings, through crowded afternoons, through quiet evenings, your memory returned in unexpected places, a familiar song, a familiar street. A familiar laugh overheard from someone else, not because the past was pulling them backward, but because truth was gently rearranging everything they thought they understood. Memories they once ignored suddenly demanded attention. Kindness they failed to appreciate became unforgettable. Moments they dismissed began glowing with unexpected meaning. It is astonishing how differently we remember people once illusion loses its power. The heart has a remarkable way of finding what truly mattered after distractions finally disappear. Yet another mystery remained. There was still one name they had not spoken aloud, one face they had not allowed themselves to fully remember, one conversation they replayed over and over without understanding why it refused to leave. They tried to ignore it. It returned. They buried it beneath busyness. It waited patiently. Some truths are not loud because they do not need to compete. They simply remain, steady, gentle, unmoving, waiting for the moment we become ready to receive them. Meanwhile, everyone around them believed they understood the situation. Friends offered advice based on assumptions. Strangers created explanations from appearances. Even those closest to them completely misunderstood the reason. They walked away. That is often how life unfolds. The deepest transformations are invisible while they are happening. Only later do people rewrite history as though they understood it all along. But they didn't, because the real story had not yet reached its turning point. There was still one final realization waiting in the shadows, one conversation that had never happened, one truth that had never been spoken, one connection that neither time nor distance had completely erased. They stood beneath an evening sky unlike any they had noticed before. The wind carried no answers, only possibilities. For the first time in years, they allowed themselves to ask a question they had been afraid to face. What if the person I believed was most important never truly was? The silence that followed did not frighten them, it invited them, because sometimes the most life-changing answer begins as silence. And then, a memory returned, not a grand memory, not a dramatic farewell, something astonishingly ordinary, a look, a sentence, a quiet kindness almost forgotten. Yet as that memory unfolded, they realized it connected to someone they had spent far too long convincing themselves no longer mattered. At that exact moment, everything they believed about the past began to shift. And what they discovered next would force them to confront a truth they never imagined possible. My beloved child, the memory refused to leave. It did not rush into their mind like a storm. It arrived the way morning light slips through a window, softly, patiently, until there was no denying it was there. They closed their eyes, hoping it would fade, yet every detail became clearer. It was a day they had almost forgotten. Nothing extraordinary had happened, no grand declaration, no dramatic goodbye, no promise whispered beneath the stars, only a conversation so ordinary that anyone else would have overlooked it. Yet now, seen through different eyes, it carried a meaning that had been hidden all along. They remembered the way you listened without trying to control them. They remembered how you never demanded they become someone else to earn your acceptance. They remembered that around you, silence never felt uncomfortable, it felt safe. That realization unsettled them more than any argument ever could. Because they began comparing what was real with what they had accepted for so long, The comparison was impossible to ignore. One relationship had been built on appearances, the other had quietly grown from sincerity. One required constant performance, the other simply invited honesty. For the first time, they understood the difference. Still, they resisted. The human heart rarely changes direction without hesitation. Questions filled their thoughts. What if I'm imagining this? What if I've misunderstood everything? What if turning back only creates more pain? Every question led to another. Every answer seemed just beyond reach. Yet beneath the uncertainty, something stronger continued growing. Peace, not the peace that comes from having every answer, the peace that comes from finally asking the right questions. Days passed. Outwardly, life continued as though nothing had changed. People greeted them, work continued, conversations came and went. But inside, an invisible transformation was unfolding. They noticed things they had never noticed before. The constant need to impress others suddenly felt exhausting. The approval they once chased no longer carried the same value. The voices they once trusted sounded strangely unfamiliar. It was as though someone had gently removed a veil from their eyes. And once that veil was gone, there was no placing it back. Meanwhile, another story was unfolding beyond their sight. Your life continued. You had your own questions, your own disappointments, your own moments when you wondered whether certain chapters had truly ended. Perhaps you had convinced yourself that some doors were meant to remain closed forever. Perhaps you had stopped expecting surprises. Perhaps you had quietly whispered, "If something is meant for me, it will find its way." Little did you know, another heart was beginning to ask similar questions, not because fate demanded it, not because destiny guaranteed it, but because people sometimes grow in ways they never expected. Growth has a remarkable way of changing what we value. There came an evening unlike the others. Rain tapped gently against the window. The room was quiet enough that every thought seemed louder than usual. Instead of reaching for distractions, they sat with their memories, one by one, not judging them, simply allowing them to speak. Some memories brought gratitude, others brought regret, a few brought tears they had refused to shed for years. Then something unexpected happened. They realized they had spent so much time trying to become the person others wanted that they had forgotten who they truly were. That realization was painful, yet strangely freeing, because healing often begins where pretending ends. As the hours passed, another question surfaced. It was one they had never dared to ask before. If I had been completely honest with myself back then, would I have made different choices? The room remained silent, yet their heart already knew the answer. Yes, that single word echoed through every forgotten moment. Yes, they would have spoken differently. Yes, they would have listened more carefully. Yes, they would have appreciated things they once overlooked. Regret has a way of sharpening vision, but true growth does something greater. It transforms regret into wisdom. The following morning, they stepped outside with no clear destination. Sometimes people walk not because they know where they are going, but because movement helps untangle thoughts that sitting still cannot. Every familiar street carried unfamiliar meaning. Places once associated with old memories now seemed to invite new beginnings. Then they passed a place connected to you, not directly, just enough to awaken another memory. They stopped, for several long moments. They simply stood there. A smile appeared without permission, not because everything had become perfect, because something genuine had survived the passing of time. Respect, gratitude, a quiet affection they had mistaken for something less important. Their heart whispered a truth they could no longer ignore. Some people leave a loud impression. Others leave a lasting one. The loud impressions fade. The lasting ones quietly remain. That realization changed everything. Yet another surprise waited just ahead. They still believed the most important person they had walked away from was someone everyone else admired. They were wrong. The greatest departure had not been from another person at all. It had been from the version of themselves that lived in constant fear. The version that needed approval. The version that believed love had to be earned through endless sacrifice. The version that stayed silent to keep others comfortable. That was the person they had truly left behind. Only after recognizing that could they begin seeing everyone else more clearly. Including you. Because when fear no longer speaks the loudest, truth finally has room to be heard. And as they lifted their eyes toward the horizon, they noticed something they had somehow missed before. Someone familiar. Not close enough to recognize immediately. Not far enough to dismiss. Their hearts skipped a beat. The next few moments would become a turning point they would remember for years. But before either of you spoke a single word, something completely unexpected happened. If you believe in God, type Amen and subscribe my channel.